Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Tip. Julian here for a little bit of a different kind of episode today. It's an episode that I always put out in January, and that is the playoff schedule, not the NHL playoff schedule, but the fantasy playoff schedule, which if you're in a position to make the playoffs, it's a really important thing to know so you can make trades or whatever you need to do to prepare for the playoffs to have the most optimal schedule possible to win it all. Before we get into it, guys, drop a like and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And without further ado, let's jump right into today's content. Now, your playoffs are probably from week 22 to 24. That is the standard fantasy playoffs. However, each league, people set them to different rules. So make sure that that is actually your playoff schedule. A lot of silly managers also set the playoff schedules for week 23 to 25, with 25 being your last week of the NHL season and your fantasy finals. The reason I think it's silly is because the last week of the season, oftentimes you see star players being benched because the team's already made the playoffs and wants to keep them fresh for the playoffs, which makes for a really anticlimactic fantasy finals. That's the last kind of thing you want in your finals, for star players to be benched and losing your finals because of that. Definitely make sure in the future to end your fantasy playoffs on week 24. Now, let's take a look at the number of games that teams play in the fantasy playoffs. First, let's take a look at weeks 22 to 24. Now, there are two teams that really have bad schedules for those weeks of the fantasy hockey playoffs. Those are New York Rangers and the San Jose Sharks, since they only play 8 games total over the 3 weeks. The Rangers 3-3-2, and the Sharks 2-3-3. Really not ideal schedules for fantasy playoffs. The teams that have the most games are Buffalo, Calgary, Dallas, Montreal, Ottawa, LA, Minnesota, and Nashville. As you can see here on the screen, they all have a total of 11 games over the 3 weeks. All of them having 4 games on 2 of the weeks and 3 on another, which is honestly really, really good. So if your team is composed of a lot of players from these teams, you're probably in pretty good shape. But if you have your playoffs week 23 to 25, the teams with the least amount of games are Boston, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. Changes quite a bit. They only have a total of 10 games over the 3 weeks. Now keep in mind that third week of week 25 is a 2-part week where it's almost 2 whole weeks of games, and having only 10 games over a span of almost 4 weeks is not really ideal. It's not the worst thing in the world. Like, you can still win your fantasy playoffs with players from these teams in your lineup. It's just a good thing to note. Now, the teams with the best schedules are Buffalo, Calgary, Dallas, Montreal, Ottawa, New York Islanders, and Detroit. A lot of the same teams as before, but a couple of new ones in the Islanders and Detroit, with 13 games apiece over the 3.5 week slate. That is pretty good. Now we're going to jump into the second most important thing that we're going to be looking at, and that's the off days that players play during your fantasy playoffs. Now, the teams with the most off days during the standard playoff schedule of weeks 22 to 24 are Minnesota, Chicago, New Jersey Devils, Vancouver, Carolina, and Columbus. Minnesota is the best because they play on 6 total off days over the 3 weeks, which is absolutely fantastic. 2 off days the first week, 1 off day the second week, and 3 off days the third week. Chicago and New Jersey, pretty great as well, with 5 apiece. And then Vancouver, Carolina, and Columbus, 4 apiece, which isn't bad either. And then the teams with the least amount of off days are Ottawa, San Jose, Montreal, Edmonton, and St. Louis. So even though Ottawa and Montreal play a lot of games, they don't have a whole lot of off days. Ottawa has 0 off days the entire schedule, and San Jose has 0 as well. Montreal, Edmonton, and St. Louis only have 1 off day the entirety of the fantasy playoffs. That being said, if you have studs like Stützle or Suzuki or McDavid, obviously you're not too worried there because you're going to be playing them on the busy nights anyway. It's really for the guys on your team who are like barely cracking the roster and only usually fit if you have them playing on off days. You have a guy like that on the Canadians, like a Doc or something like that. They may not fit in your schedule. So you might want to swap him or trade him come the fantasy playoffs so that he's not always sitting on your bench. For the later playoff schedule, weeks 23 to 25, the teams with the most off days are Detroit, Minnesota, Vancouver, Edmonton, New Jersey, New York, with 6 off days apiece. And then Calgary, Dallas, Anaheim, Carolina, Chicago, and San Jose each play 5 off days during the fantasy playoffs. Now, that's a bit of a skewed stat because week 25, part 2, 3 of the 4 days are off days, and probably you're going to be able to fit players on all those days. So if you remove that stat, the teams with the most off days are Minnesota with 6, New Jersey with 5, Calgary, Anaheim, Chicago, Vancouver, Edmonton, and New York with 4 in the first 3 weeks of the fantasy playoffs, not including that very last week. The teams with the least amount of off days are Buffalo and Boston, which only play 1 off day apiece. Then Ottawa, Colorado, Vegas, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh only play 2 off days the entirety of the fantasy playoffs. So just something there to keep in mind. I do already have the full tables made, and they are already posted on my Patreon. So if you do want to take your support to the next level or you were considering it, do look in the description down below and you'll have full access to all the tables of the off days as well as the teams with the most games and least games during the fantasy playoffs. And that's going to help you optimize your roster a little bit. So what conclusion have I drawn after making all of these schedules? Well, if you have your standard playoff weeks from week 22 to 24, the team with the absolute best schedule is the Minnesota Wild. They play 11 games over the course of the 3 weeks and have 6 of those 11 games on off nights, which opens up your schedule to play players who are a little bit less rostered on your busy nights. I like that a lot. Now, if you have your schedule from week 23 to 25, the team with the best schedule is probably the Calgary Flames. They play 13 games over those 3.5 weeks, including 4 off-day games, or 5 if you include the second half of week 3 as well. That is pretty good. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you can trade for Minnesota Wild players, it is not a bad idea to do so, and that really opens up your schedule for the fantasy finals to really stream anybody you want. Same thing with Calgary if you play the later playoff schedule. And that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed my content today, drop a like and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you have any questions, be sure to ask them down in the comments below. I'll try my best to answer them all. And if you do want to take that support to the next level, definitely be sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description below. I will post these charts eventually on the YouTube channel as well, but as of right now, they are up on Patreon. That's it, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Fantasy Tipped.